What is a lease option and how does it help in real estate transactions? For a while back in 2018, 19, and 20, I was doing most of my exit strategies were lease options. Lease options are very unique in the sense that they can be both the way to acquire the property and also the way to sell the property and make money on it. So let's go through what a lease option is. A lease option, okay, there's multiple variations of it. Let's say that I've got a seller right here that is looking to sell their property. And here I am, Pace, the real estate investor. And I say, I want to buy your property. Typically, I'll reach out to that seller and say, I want to buy your property subject to. I want to take over the existing mortgage and I want to step into your shoes with the bank and essentially avoid using credit, avoid using any sort of application or anything like that. No W-2, no tax returns, nothing. And I want to buy this property subject to. Well, sometimes, very rarely, I will get a seller that will say, I'm too afraid of the due on sale clause. Okay, if you are an agent, a broker, and you are also afraid of the due on sale clause, go and check out our YouTube channel. We have a lot of due on sale clause content. We'll give you guys some links in the description down below. It no longer happens to me, but back in 2018, it would happen to me a lot, where I could not overcome the objection the seller would have about due on sale and their willingness to sell their property to me via subject to. And so I would acquire on a lease option instead of acquire via subject to. Now, why is that better for the seller? It's better for the seller because there is no due on sale clause and there is no deed transfer either. Okay, so here's what happens. The investor says, instead of us just taking it over subject to, we're gonna do a lease option, and here's what a lease option looks like. It is actually two separate agreements. There is a lease, okay, where I am the tenant. I am not the real estate investor, I'm the tenant. I have the ability to rent the property from that landlord, and that is one agreement. That is the lease agreement. You guys have all seen lease agreements 100 times, so you don't need me to talk about a rent agreement. It's just renting the property. Then you have a separate agreement, which is called the option agreement. And this option agreement is typically purchased at a fee. It's like an upfront fee. We call it an option fee. And that option fee for me, I'll get to how I sell properties on lease options, but usually it's like 1 month of rent extra. And what this does is this option gives me a locked in price and usually 3, 5, or 7 years to execute my option with the seller and buy the property from him. Now, this is the traditional way a lease option works. The way that I would, as the real estate investor, execute my option is I would have to go to a bank or B, cash, okay? And I would go to the seller, let's say in 3 years, and I'd say, hey, seller, I'm ready to execute the option. I'm ready to buy the property from you. Thank you for doing a lease with me for the last 3 years. I'm now ready to exercise my option at this time and actually buy the property from you and wipe you out of the transaction. So where is a lease option beneficial? A lease option is beneficial because what it does is it protects the seller. The seller can continue to cash flow and still have the benefits of ownership. The buyer locks in a future price, so they know the landlord cannot just sell the property out from underneath them. The landlord is locked in as well. And a lot of times the lease option, the lease does not get raised, right? The rent does not get raised, so it locks in the lease payment for a number of years. What it then does is it gives the confidence to this investor to say, okay, I know that I need to go build my credit, I need to fix my credit, I need to get more income, I need to save up a larger down payment. So at some point I can go to the bank, but I have the confidence to know that the seller's willing to sell it to me because I have an option contract that gives me the ability to go and buy this property at a locked in price, at a locked in time frame that gives me the time and the energy allocation to go and do this thing. Okay, that is what a lease option is traditionally used for. Now, what's great about this is I, as the investor or the tenant, I can turn around and do a number of things with this house. I can turn into a short-term rental, midterm rental, I can turn into whatever I want it because I have rights as a tenant to use this property for my own good. Now, what I also can do, all right, this is what we call a sandwich lease option. These are not that common, but there are people that teach these and they just don't happen that often. They are out there, but they're not super common, okay? What will happen is I decide, okay, now I have control of this property. I have it underneath, let's say it's a 3-year option, and I have 3 years of rent locked in, and I have 3 years to execute my option. All right, my rent payment, let's say, is $2,000 a month is my rent to the landlord. I have an option fee of, let's say, $2,500. Okay, perfect, that's my structure, and I have 3 years to go get a bank loan or pay the property off in cash. All right, now what I can do is I can then go out and I can then find another tenant buyer. Okay, this is what we call a sandwich lease option. I bought the property on a lease option. I can then turn around and sell the property on a lease option to another tenant buyer, where I can go, hey tenant, your property, I'm gonna rent this to you for $2,400 a month, and I want an option fee of $7,500, okay? Now, what did you just see me do? You saw me arbitrage a lease and an option, and I give them 3 years, okay, to go out and execute the option. So if they don't execute the option in 3 years, let's say that in 3 years they haven't fixed their credit, they haven't had additional income, they are now like, oh man, I need to extend. Well, they could extend to 5 or 7 years, depending on my agreement, as long as I have that same agreement with the seller that says I can extend to 5 or 7 years. And 1,000 different things could happen in the situation. I could raise their rent, I could add for another option fee. That's typically what I would do, is when my tenants could not execute their option at the end of 3 years, I would ask them for an extension on the option fee, and I would get another $7,500. Now, you guys might say, why would anybody do this? You know, I'd probably say hundreds of times a month all over the country this is happening, where investors come in and go, I don't have the money to buy the property, I'm just gonna arbitrage this and go find my own tenant and get that tenant to have the ability to have a locked-in option. Now, some people would ask, why would I do an option? I would do an option if I just landed a job and I have not had that job long enough to go get a bank loan, but I also don't want my landlord selling the property because I love the house, I'm excited about it, and I want 3 years to build my credit and put myself in a situation where I can go get a bank loan. You want an option on that house. You want the option to buy that property so that that landlord is locked in and guaranteed to sell that property to you, if that makes sense. So that is what a lease option is. Now, what is so cool about the option is that you can draft the option to be whatever you want. All right, so we're gonna talk about now, we've talked about what a lease option is and how it benefits multiple people. It overcomes a lot of sellers' need for the due on sale clause. They're worried about the due on sale clause. It gives the seller a locked-in lease, gives them a locked-in option price, gives the investor the ability to get into the deal with very little money or anything out of pocket, especially if you go get your own tenant and their rent payment is higher and their option fee is higher than you, then you covered your cost to get into the deal and you're making $400 a month on arbitrage plus $5,000 up front. Pretty awesome. Sandwich lease options are pretty great. I don't do them anymore because I want to own the property, all right? Now, in the transaction we're going to talk about today, you guys can see that we've got part 1 through part 6 on the whiteboard video. We're actually doing a series right now, and this is the final part talking about how a lease option actually solves the problem for the debt to income ratio. So let's talk about that. If you guys are just watching this video because you're like, I was interested in what a lease option is, go back to part 1 of this series where we actually help a seller. You'll see me talk to an agent about a problem they're dealing with. You'll see me talk to a seller about the problem that the agent and them are having. And then you'll hear me pitch a lease option to Tim, the lender, to overcome the debt to income ratio on a transaction. So a lot of really intricate things here, but go back and watch part 1 through part 5 and you'll really understand where we're at. So Victoria, as you guys remember, is the agent selling Robbie's house. The buyer on this house canceled on them last minute, but Robbie and his family were already approved by Tim, the lender, to buy a second home. And the only reason they were approved to buy the second home is because they were selling the property they're currently in. When that buyer over here canceled, it created a need for them, either A, B, or C. A, they had to relist the property and abandon this house that they're emotionally excited about. B, they had to go find a cash buyer that would buy the house so they could go move into the house that they're emotionally excited about. Or C, use creative finance to solve all of these problems, and that's the route that they chose to take. So I came on, and Victoria called me. You guys will see this in part 2. Part 3 and part 4 is you'll actually see the live calls and the problems actually being thrown to me, and you'll see me live solve these problems on these phone calls, okay? So Victoria calls me, she says, Pace, I've got this problem. I convince her that creative finance is the solution to that problem, where I buy this property subject to, and I take over the existing mortgage so that Robbie, the seller, and his family can go and move into this house and get a new loan from Tim. The main question that was asked was, how do we overcome the debt to income ratio? How do we get, if you're gonna buy this property subject to, how can Tim get you approved for a second home if you're leaving this mortgage in place via a subject to transaction? Now, if you guys don't know what subject to is, my team will put what is subject to explained down below, and you can go and get a full education on what subject to is. Okay, so here we are. Tim is saying, okay, I got it, Pace. I know you've done deals with Victoria in the past, subject to. I know she trusts you, I trust you, but how do we overcome the debt to income ratio? The underwriter that I'm doing this deal with is gonna have a problem with Robbie keeping his loan in place. So you have two solutions, okay, to overcome the debt to income ratio. Okay, one of them is you just show that you bought the property subject to, and you show a third-party servicer. You show that you have a third-party servicer that is making those payments on your behalf, and I would say 90% of the time, I can just do it this way. Option two is instead of buying it on subject to, I buy it on a lease option, where in my option agreement, okay, my OA, my option agreement, it states I can execute the option via sub to in less than 12 months. Does that make sense? A little gangster way to use lease options to still buy a property subject to. Why would I use a lease option versus subject to overcome Tim's problem? Well, because Tim is not the person that actually makes the approval for loans. It's actually an underwriter. If you guys remember my conversation with Tim, go back and rewatch this if you haven't. It's really, really good. I'm talking to Tim, the lender, about his underwriter, and lenders don't make approvals. Their underwriters do. And so based on the underwriter's education level, if they're not that educated about real estate and creative finance, I will not use subject to as my acquisition strategy. I will use a lease option because they're a little bit easier to understand for people that are brand new to it. It's like, okay, it's a lease that gives you an option to buy it at some point in the future. Okay, yeah, I'm okay with that. And then it gives the underwriter a box to check in their mind of like, okay, Robbie is leasing the property to Pace, and because Robbie is not making those payments to his own mortgage, Pace is actually leasing the property from Robbie, then I, the underwriter, feel comfortable removing that debt to income ratio and getting them approved for the loan. And that's what we did. We ended up going with a lease option. So the structure of the lease option is I'm leasing the property from Robbie. I have a lease agreement. In my lease agreement, it says my payments that I make to Robbie, 100% of them go to the mortgage, and I get credit for those payments against the mortgage if I end up executing the option. Inside of my option, it states that I can execute this not by going to a bank, not by paying the property off cash, but I can execute this via subject to within the next 12 months. So why do I do that? I do that because I don't want to own properties on lease options. I want to own properties via subject to, because now I have the deed in my name. I have full control. I have no issues going back to the seller at some point. In a lease option, if the seller dies, I have to go through a whole legal conundrum of saying, hey, judge, I know the seller died, but I do have an option to buy the property, and now I can't get a hold of the seller because obviously the seller's in the ground and I can't finish this transaction. In a subject to transaction, I don't care what happens with the seller. I do, but I don't. Professionally, I don't. And I'd rather just own everything via subject to, so I don't have to go and deal with transferring from a lease option to a sub to at some point later down the road. Now, there's a lot that I just said. This is a very hairy video, and a lot of information came out really, really fast. So what I want you guys to do is, if you guys have questions about any of this stuff, you have questions about lease options, you have questions about subject to, you have questions about this transaction, first thing I would do is make a comment down below and tell us what your questions are so that we can make a dedicated video based on those topics. But then what I would do is I would go back all the way through and I would watch this series of how the problem arose, how the agent explains the problem to me, why it couldn't be a cash deal, how I pitched to the seller subject to, how I pitched this lender, and how the lender came back to me and said, we need to do a lease option, and how I ultimately explained that to Victoria. And then part 6 is what you're watching right now, which is what is a lease option and how does it overcomes the debt to income ratio conundrum that a lot of people are really overly worried about. There's so many other things that we could do too. We could have done option 3 is we could have done an agreement for sale. We could have done a contract for deed. Okay, we could have done a whole bunch of other things, but the reason why I don't go this route is because the underwriter is not educated about real estate typically, and so this would confuse them to go this route. So if I'm not trying to overcome the debt to income ratio, then I would typically go this route. If I'm trying to overcome the debt to income ratio with an underwriter that is not that educated, I'm going lease option because it's less stuff for them to digest, if that makes sense. So hopefully this was super helpful. If I had this 5 years ago, 7 years ago, 10 years ago, oh my gosh, if I had this 10 years ago, this explanation, it would have made me make so much more money and solve so many more problems that just traditional real estate cannot solve. So make a comment, let us know what your questions are, and we'll potentially do a part 7 with all your questions that we get and put it in the same series so you guys can go back and watch this and go, oh, here's all the questions people had, and here's how Pace answered all those questions. So hopefully we'll see you in part 7.